Professor, we're back in session. I gather that you may have problems, perhaps, seeing some of the documents. If you need them enlarged, just please say.
I will.
Professor Hay, I've been asking you about what you described as an international consensus as to the nature of non-A, non-B hepatitis. You'd referred to a number of papers, Minucci and the Stevens paper, which I understand. You referred also to the paper co-authored by Dr. Lilliman, and I'm just going to ask for that to go on screen so we could have a look at that. Henry, it's OXUH 301751_003. And can we just zoom in a bit closer, please, to the top half of the page? Is this the paper to which you were referring, Professor Hay?
No, I was referring to one from 1975, actually.
Fine, we don't, I think, have that. In relation to this paper, was this a paper that you were aware of at the time?
I don't remember it.
Don't worry, in that case, I won't ask you anything further about this particular paper. Could we then have on screen, Henry, BART 302487. And again, if we could just zoom in to the top half of the letter so we can see what it is. Professor Hay, this is a letter, I don't suggest you would have seen this at the time. It's a letter dated the 27th of April 1979, and it's from Dr. Kernoff, who, as you've already referred to, had a particular long-standing interest in hepatitis, to Dr. Colvin. Henry, could we go to the second page, please? And could you zoom in on, could we have the whole of that second paragraph? Thank you. So you'll see there's a paragraph, Professor, beginning types of therapeutic material available. Yep. And then if we go about 2/3 of the way through that paragraph, there's a sentence beginning, the clinical reason, actually I'll pick it up just before that to make sense of it. Not only is commercial concentrate expensive, but there are both clinical and moral reasons for preferring the NHS material. The clinical reason is the growing awareness of the probability that commercial concentrates have a higher risk of transmitting non-A, non-B hepatitis than NHS material. This is a serious disease with long-term consequences, which, as far as is known, is at present much less common in the UK than in those parts of the world, particularly the USA, where donor blood for commercial concentrates is collected. Now, I'm not asking you, Professor, about the whether there was a different risk from NHS and commercial concentrates. But just in terms of Dr. Kernoff's characterisation of non-A, non-B hepatitis, he describes it as a serious disease with long-term consequences. Would you, was that your understanding in the early 1980s, and that characterisation of non-A, non-B hepatitis?
No.
So you would not have characterised it as, would you disagree with serious or long-term consequences, or both?
Well, I think the long-term consequences were unknown. I mean, it clearly is a correct statement as we now know it, but at that time, the long-term consequences were not known. I think that was part of the problem. The liver biopsy studies that have been published were all looking at the early stages of the disease. There was a consensus forming around that time that this was not a serious problem.
Other than the papers to which you've referred, so I think you told us about Minucci in 82, the Richard Stevens paper in 81, and you've referred to a Lilliman paper in 1975, which I'm afraid we don't have available at the moment.
There's also the Australian paper from Rickard.
Oh yes, and an Australian paper. Are those the sources of your understanding that there was an international consensus, or was it your training or discussions or something else?
Well, it was partly my training, but I've just highlighted some of the papers. I mean, I think there are about 300 references in my MD thesis, but those are perhaps the most important.
And what about Professor Preston's own 1978 work? What was your understanding in 1983 of what that paper showed?
Well, it showed a variety of different types of hepatitis histologically, which included mostly relatively low grades of inflammation.
So it included
mostly relatively low grades of inflammation.
If we just have a look at that, Henry, it's PRSE 303622. And if we could zoom in on the top half of the right-hand column, please, Henry. So we've got the paper there. I know you're familiar with it, Professor Preston. September the 16th, 1978. We have the title of it there, Percutaneous Liver Biopsy and Chronic Liver Disease in Haemophiliacs. And then the summary refers to liver biopsies being carried out on 8 symptom-free patients under Factor VIII cover. A wide spectrum of chronic liver disease was demonstrated, including chronic aggressive hepatitis and cirrhosis. And then if we go to the second page, please. Just down the table at the bottom of the page. I'm not proposing to go through the detail of it with you, Professor, but we looked at it with Professor Preston, and he set out what he was referring to by reference to the various terms there set out. Do you say that this paper supports a consensus that non-A, non-B hepatitis was mild and non-progressive?
Well, it's certainly less supportive than some of the others, because there are 2 cases of cirrhosis there. But apart from that, and I'm not sure exactly how these patients were selected either, because the 2 cases of cirrhosis may have had physical signs that led to their liver biopsies. But the papers of Minucci showed only 1 case of cirrhosis, and he referred to it as the non-progressive course of non-A, non-B hepatitis. And I think that similar findings from the paper of Stevens et al.
What we also see from this table, as well as the 2 cases of cirrhosis, are 2 cases of chronic aggressive hepatitis, which was characterised for us by Professor Preston as being more serious and significant than chronic persistent hepatitis was then understood to be. Do you disagree with that characterisation?
No, it's now known as chronic active hepatitis. In non-A, non-B hepatitis, or rather hepatitis C, it can progress to cirrhosis, though there are also instances of it going back to chronic persistent hepatitis.
Professor Hay, the paper by Minucci may be said to lend some support for your view of how non-A, non-B hepatitis was understood, at least by some. Do you maintain your view, however, that was the consensus view, as opposed to there being potentially a range of different views emerging in the literature?
Well, there's always a range of views, but I think the consensus view was that it was relatively benign and non-progressive.
You referred in your statement to one professor using the term a biochemical curiosity about non-A, non-B hepatitis, or about the liver function abnormalities. Who was that professor, and when was that, roughly?
That was Professor Sam Machin, and that would have been about 1983-84, when I was chatting with him about our findings, and he expressed surprise that we were still interested in this liver disease, because he said it was a biochemical curiosity. Naturally, by that stage, I would have violently disagreed with that view.
By 1983, 1984, you would have disagreed with that view?
Yes.
And what was it that led to your own personal realisation that non-A, non-B hepatitis was not benign and non-progressive?
Well, I observed a patient in clinic who came along and told me he'd been admitted to the local hospital, having sort of gone to sleep, and gave a very vague story. His wife was with him. But I examined him, and he had clear physical signs of cirrhosis of the liver. But he was one of the patients with chronic persistent hepatitis previously reported by Professor Preston. And our understanding was that that particular histological appearance, which is of very mild inflammation, not chronic active hepatitis, was thought to be benign and non-progressive. So this was clearly a very odd thing. He was relatively elderly, but he progressed from chronic persistent hepatitis in the late 70s to full-blown cirrhosis with hepatic encephalopathy, which implies a degree of hepatic failure, in the space of only 6 years. So I brought this to the attention of Professor Preston and Dr. Trigger, who was the hepatologist, and they agreed that this was a remarkable observation, and we agreed that we should be monitoring our patients more closely with liver biopsy.
And doing the best you can, was that 1983 or 1984?
I think it may have been late 1983.
And then if we just look at the paper that was then published in the Lancet in June of 85, Henry, it's PRSE 304229. And if we zoom in on the bottom half of the page, please, Henry. So this is the paper co-authored between yourself, Professor Preston, Dr. Trigger and Dr. Underwood, Progressive Liver Disease and Haemophilia, an Understated Problem. Just going to read the summary for the benefit of those following. In an 8-year study of 79 unselected patients with haemophilia who had received clotting factor concentrates, there was evidence of chronic progressive liver disease in at least 17, 21%. 8 patients had chronic active hepatitis and 9 had cirrhosis, 5 with esophageal varices. Histological evidence suggested that non-A, non-B hepatitis was mainly responsible, although the influence of other viruses could not be excluded. Serial liver biopsies showed progression from chronic persistent hepatitis to chronic active hepatitis and cirrhosis within 6 years, suggesting that chronic persistent hepatitis in haemophiliacs is not as benign as hitherto supposed. And then the last sentence of the summary, it's anticipated that liver disease in haemophiliacs will become an increasing clinical problem in the future. So this was the result of work that had in fact been undertaken over an 8-year period, so prior to your joining.
It's an 8-year period because it includes all the data from Professor Preston's earlier study.
And then in terms of the process of undertaking further biopsies, the serial liver biopsies referred to, were you directly involved in that process?
Yes.
This tells us that the 8-year study of patients was of 79 unselected patients. How were patients identified or selected for biopsy? Can you recall?
Well, the patients who'd been biopsied before, who did not have cirrhosis, or at least hadn't had cirrhosis before, were approached for consent to biopsy again to see if their liver disease had changed, and it was explained to them that we had some doubts about the current view about the natural history of non-A, non-B hepatitis, and we couldn't make any assumptions, and we wanted to know what was happening with their liver disease, and the only way to find out was to do a liver biopsy. And further patients who had abnormal liver function tests were approached, and a similar conversation took place.
And then if we go to the second page, please, Henry. If we look at the bottom half of the page, under the left-hand column under the heading Results, please, Henry. We can see this is what's recorded. Initial biopsy in 34 patients showed chronic persistent hepatitis in 20, chronic lobular hepatitis in 1. Pausing there, could you just explain for us chronic lobular hepatitis as distinct from chronic persistent and chronic active?
I think chronic lobular hepatitis is a similar low grade of inflammation.
And chronic active hepatitis in 9 and established micronodular cirrhosis in 4. And then the next paragraph refers to 9 patients having a second biopsy. And we can then see that you set out various matters relating to that, and you say cirrhosis was present in at least 9 of the 34 patients. And then we can see the table with the results of the serial liver biopsies. The first biopsy having shown chronic persistent hepatitis in 6, and then there's 4 in showing chronic active hepatitis. And then the second biopsy showing, as I understand it, that in patients 3 and 4, the chronic progressive hepatitis was now showing to be chronic active hepatitis. Patients 5 and 6 had progressed to cirrhosis. Likewise, patients 8 and 9. Patient 7, perhaps somewhat curiously, had gone from chronic active hepatitis to chronic persistent hepatitis. Is that a correct reading of that part of the results?
Yes, it is.
And so is it fair to say that the significance of this paper was the further light it shone on chronic persistent hepatitis and its potential to progress to serious liver damage?
Yes.
And then, Professor Hay, for the sake of completeness, we'll just look at the 2 other publications from the Lancet in 1985 to which you contributed. Henry, could we have PRSE 304594, please? And if we could just zoom in on the bottom half of the page, please, Henry. So this is July 1985 in the Lancet, Professor, and we can see it's a letter co-authored by Professor Preston, you, Dr. Dewar, Dr. Greaves, Dr. Trigger, non-A, non-B hepatitis and heat-treated factor VIII concentrates. Is this the letter that you were referring to earlier, which talked about the problems experienced with the trials of the ARMA heat-treated products in 1984?
It is.
And the 2 patients who developed significant non-A, non-B hepatitis within a fairly rapid period of time?
Yes, quite short incubation, unusually severe.
And then the third article in the Lancet from 1985 is WITN 3289051. Please, Henry. And if you go to the next page, so in fact, if you go down the page, please. Next page, sorry, Henry. There are two letters entitled Liver Disease and Haemophilia. If we zoom in on this one, so the second letter entitled Liver Disease and Haemophilia is the one authored by you, Professor Preston, Dr. Trigger and Dr. Underwood.
Yes.
And this is, I think you referred to this in your statement, this is the disagreement that emerged through the pages of the Lancet between those undertaking the work at Sheffield that we've just looked at and Professor Minucci and Dr. Colombo.
Indeed.
And this letter identifies two possible reasons for difference. The age of the cohort being biopsied and studied, and patient selection. Is that a fair summary?
Yes, I guess so.
Before we leave this, is there anything further you wanted to say about this letter?
No, not particularly. I think the significance is that it was not immediately accepted by everybody. And Minucci argued back in defence of his own earlier assessment.
I'm going to move on to ask you about the developing knowledge of the risk of AIDS.
Well, before you do
Yes.
that, can I just ask you one further question about the consensus? The title of your article in the Lancet was an understated problem, and you said
Yes.
that was a parody of Stephen's article in 1982. No,
it was 1981.
81, I'm sorry, where he said, is it an overstated problem?
Yes.
Why would he think that it was an overstated problem if the consensus was that it wasn't?
Well, he published that before Minucci came along and published his paper in 1982. So there clearly was some diversity of opinion, but by the early 80s, I think the consensus was, oh, well, it's not so much to worry about. In the 70s, people sort of became aware of the problem and would naturally have been worried about it. We know that hepatitis B can progress to cirrhosis and hepatocellular carcinoma in chronic carriers, for example. There would certainly have been concerns about the progress of non-A, non-B hepatitis based on theoretical considerations alone. But various liver biopsies had been done, and as time went by, they appeared, or at least were interpreted, to suggest that, well, maybe this isn't as big a problem as we thought it was. I think it's against that context. So you've got the Stevens paper and then another liver biopsy series from Minucci, which also, in its title, talked about it being non-progressive. But the interesting thing is, a lot of this is about interpretation, because even the Minucci paper, it was about 11 patients, quite a small series to base any sort of conclusion on, and one of those patients had cirrhosis. So looking at the same data, and I think in our correspondence we point out that to him, you could argue that, well, 10% of your patients have got cirrhosis, and we're showing 15%. So why are you arguing the toss?
Yes, I see. So the one thing that seems to be clear, tell me if this is fair, is that there was a significant risk, a risk that hepatitis, serious hepatitis might result, but people were at odds over time, views differing, as to quite how serious the risk was. Is that fair?
I think particularly in the 70s there was probably greater dichotomy of opinion, but by the early 80s, I think that they'd settled around thinking, oh well, it wasn't such a big problem after all. That was my perception, talking to colleagues from around the country and reading the literature. And I think it was Professor Preston's perception too, to be honest. But then we started to see more people with serious liver disease, and the closer we looked, the more we found. Not everyone with cirrhosis will have physical signs of cirrhosis. They often don't. So it's only if you do a liver biopsy, or more recently we would of course do a FibroScan. We have non-invasive methods now, but back then the only way to find out was to do a liver biopsy.
Right, thank you very much.
Professor Preston, can you recall when and how you first became aware of reports of AIDS in haemophiliacs in the States?
Well, the very early 1980s, when there was a run on pentamidine. CDC recognised that they were issuing far more pentamidine, which is a treatment for pneumocystis pneumonia, than they expected. Now, pneumocystis pneumonia is a type of pneumonia that haematologists are very familiar with because we see it in our immunosuppressed patients with lymphoma or leukemia. But it's not common. It's caused by an opportunist pathogen. And CDC in the United States realized that this sudden increase was being used in a different risk group. And it was predominantly being used for homosexual men who were presenting with pneumocystis pneumonia. And it was at that point, I think 1981, maybe 82, that they really began to realise that there was a new disease out there.
We know that there were reports in July of 1982 in the MMWR publication produced by CDC of PCP observed in haemophiliacs. This was shortly before you would have been taking up your post at the blood transfusion service.
Yes.
Would the MMWRs have been a publication that you saw or had access to at that time?
No.
Can you recall what, if any, discussion there was in the 6 months you were at the blood transfusion centre, so from August 82 to April 83, about the risk of AIDS and AIDS as a potential blood-borne virus?
I don't remember anything about that.
Do you recall reading the article in the New England Journal of Medicine, January 1983, by Jane DeForge, about AIDS and haemophilia? We can put it up on screen, so it's a slightly unfair question without showing you the document. It's PRSC 302410. And it's New England Journal of Medicine, January 83, AIDS and Preventive Treatment in Haemophilia. And if we go to the bottom paragraph, please, Henry, we can see there it refers, third line down, reports from the Centres for Disease Control include 3 haemophiliacs among cases of AIDS. And then there's further discussion about the presentation of AIDS. And then if we go over the page, the last paragraph, please, left-hand column, Henry. It says, the fact that haemophiliacs are at risk for AIDS is becoming clear. If the use of cryoprecipitate will minimise this risk, the current home infusion programme needs to be revised. And then the last two sentences, physicians involved in the care of haemophiliacs must now be alert to this risk. Preventing the complications of the present treatment may have to take precedence over preventing the complications of haemophilia itself. Leave aside for a moment, Professor, the reference to use of cryoprecipitate. Was this an article, as far as you can recall, that you saw at the time?
I can't remember. I don't remember the specific article. I think I was aware of the 3 cases in the US, one way or the other, during certainly by 1983. I can't remember exactly when I started to take the New England Journal.
Now we also
I started to take the Lancet earlier. I think I don't think I was taking the New England Journal at that point.
Now, we know that in around December of 1982, there were reports of a baby, a San Franciscan baby, 20-month-old baby, transfused with platelets, developing the AIDS syndrome. And we know that that is something that, as a matter of fact, came to the attention of Professor Preston, along with an update as to what the current position was in terms of AIDS and haemophiliacs, at a meeting in late January 1983. Now that, of course, is whilst you're still at the Regional Transfusion Centre in 3 months before you joined the Royal Hallamshire. But when you joined the Royal Hallamshire in April 1983, can you recall what discussions there were about AIDS and the risk of AIDS being transmissible by blood or blood products?
Well, I can remember that it was recognised that it was beginning to appear in patients with haemophilia, and that we assumed that it was caused probably by a virus. There were some contrary hypotheses, but they never gained much traction. So I think we assumed it was caused by an unknown virus, and we didn't know what the risk was. We assumed that all blood products might carry it, I think, because it was beginning to appear in the UK population as well. By UK population, I mean the general population.
Now, we also know that in around March of 1983, haemophilia centre directors were asked to look out for symptoms or signs of AIDS in their patients and report back to Dr. Krask if they detected any such signs. Do
Indeed.
you recall whether, is that something that you were asked to undertake as part of your routine care of patients, to look out for signs of AIDS, and if so, alert Professor Preston?
Yes.
And then, did you, as a matter of fact, identify, as far as you can recall, in any of the patients at the Sheffield Centre at that time, any such signs?
I don't remember.
And then you've produced a document from June 1983. Henry, could we have WITN 3289041? If we just zoom in on that, this is the letter of the 24th of June 1983, sent to centre directors by Professor Bloom and Dr. Ritzer, following a special meeting of reference centre directors, and it sets out in the 2 numbered paragraphs there 2 general recommendations. If we just look at those recommendations, it says at 1, for mildly affected patients with haemophilia A or von Willebrand's disease and minor lesions, treatment with DDAVP should be considered because of the increased risk of transmitting hepatitis by means of large pool concentrates in such patients. This is in any case the usual practice of mini-directors. Was that the usual practice at the Sheffield Centre at that time?
It was already the usual practice because of non-A, non-B hepatitis.
And then in 2, it says for treatment of children, and we can leave that aside, and mildly affected patients or patients unexposed to imported concentrates, many directors already reserve supplies of NHS concentrates, cryoprecipitate or freeze-dried, and it would be circumspect to continue this policy. So, taking first of all mildly affected patients, this is a suggestion that if you have an existing policy of treating them with cryo or NHS concentrates, continue. Did this lead to any change of approach for your mildly affected patients, or were you already predominantly using DDAVP?
I think we were already doing that, and as you've already pointed out to me, at the Children's Hospital they were using predominantly cryoprecipitate or NHS concentrate at that time.
And then in terms of patients unexposed to imported concentrates, was there any particular approach or policy agreed at the Sheffield Centre in relation to that category of patients in light of this letter?
Well, I don't think it changed very much because we already had a policy of keeping people to the brand that they were on. And if people had been treated exclusively with British products, that would continue.
But if it was a patient who was a new patient, maybe I don't know that you didn't come across any in your time there, a new patient who hadn't previously been treated with imported concentrates, would they have been started on NHS concentrates, or would it have depended on availability?
It would have depended on availability, I think.
And then, other than the continuation of the existing policies you've described and the early use of heat-treated products, which you've already referred to, were there, as far as you know, any other changes to the approach to treatment at the Sheffield Centre in 83-84 in response to the risk of AIDS?
I can't think of any. I think we deferred some surgery.
Do you know whether that would have been 1983 or 84 or indeed later?
I'm not sure, to be honest. But I seem to remember that some surgery was deferred. That happened in quite a few places.
Was any consideration given to a suspension, at least on a temporary basis, of the home treatment programme?
Well, I think this was discussed. I can't say exactly when, because as you've pointed out, the suggestion did come up in the literature occasionally. So it wasn't something that was completely ignored. But it was certainly Professor Preston's view, and I think that this was commonly the case, that this would be resisted by the patients, was not recommended by the Haemophilia Society or the World Federation of Haemophilia. I think what people were trying to do, this comes across in some of the minutes involved with Professor Bloom, was to try and balance up the risks. Now, on the one hand, if you go back to cryo, you have an immediate supply problem because cryo wasn't being very much produced, and the requirement for factor 8 had tripled during the previous decade. So I'm not sure there would have been enough cryo, and certainly you would have had to turn the transfusion service on its head to suddenly produce a whole lot of cryo, which would not have happened overnight. Then you would have reverted to the life expectancy that had pertained before the advent of concentrate. Now, the introduction of cryo improved life expectancy enormously because in the pre-treatment era it was 10 to 15 years, and it increased to about 40. Actuarial methods published by Charlie Ritza et al. Suggested that we'd nearly normalised life expectancy. So changing back to cryo would have been expected to have reduced life expectancy, maybe not dramatically, but to some extent. They were trying to balance this up, because this was all knowledge that was known at the time, trying to balance this up against the big unknown. Now, of course, if we'd known then what we know now, the argument for switching to cryo would have been very much stronger. But they were trying to balance a known change in life expectancy on the one hand against an unknown effect of AIDS. And I think at the time they were doing that, in 1983, there was one patient reported with AIDS, and by the following year it had gone up to about 3, as far as I can recall. So, you know, numerically, the problem didn't appear big, but there clearly was an enormous degree of uncertainty, because the natural history of HIV had not yet unfolded, and we had no idea how many patients were affected.
Can I try and unpick some of that with you, Professor? First of all,
yes.
As far as Sheffield is concerned, can you recall whether there was positive consideration was given, whether at the weekly meetings you've described or otherwise, to reverting to cryoprecipitate, either in whole or in part? Was there actual discussion about that in Sheffield?
Yes, there was.
And what was the forum for that? Was that on a regional basis, or was it in the weekly meetings you've described?
Well, we certainly discussed it in the weekly meetings. Whether it was more widely discussed, I don't know. But Professor Preston rejected it. As far as I'm aware, John Lilliman rejected the idea as well. They quoted other colleagues' consensus documents. I think it was considered fairly widely.
You've raised one possible practical impediment, that of supply. Now, we've seen evidence, for example, from, and I'm not suggesting you would necessarily have been aware of this at the time, from an October 1983 UK HCDO meeting, where Dr. Chisholm in Southampton said that she had unlimited supplies of cryoprecipitate. Her problem was getting commercial concentrates, and some other directors agreed. So,
well, I think it would have varied from region to region, because this is a product that's produced by the local transfusion centre, and it's not just used for haemophilia. It was also used for the treatment of disseminated intravascular coagulation and other acquired bleeding problems. But, it varied from centre to centre. When I got to Manchester, for example, admittedly much later than this, they'd stopped manufacturing cryoprecipitate altogether, and I had to actually ask them to start making it again.
Do you know whether Professor Preston or indeed Dr. Lilliman approached the Sheffield Regional Transfusion Centre or Dr. Wagstaff to explore with them the possibility of increasing production of cryoprecipitate?
If he did, I don't know about it.
Then, in your statement, you've set out a number of concerns about possible reversion to cryoprecipitate, some of which you've touched on in your oral evidence. You said in your statement that cryoprecipitate was incompatible with home therapy. We've heard evidence that of a number of haemophiliacs in the course of the 1970s receiving home treatment through the use of cryoprecipitate. Would you accept that incompatible is perhaps an overstatement?
I wasn't aware of that at the time. I am aware of it now. But what I would say about that is that it was a minority of centres that had some pilot, what I would describe as pilot projects of home therapy with cryo, because logistically it was quite challenging. You'd need a minus 40 to minus 60 freezer. A domestic freezer would not do. These are sort of great big bulky things, they're quite expensive. Not everyone would have room for it. Many of the patients actually complained about the amount of space their factor VIII concentrate took up in their fridge. Some patients had to have more than one domestic fridge, but at least the concentrate you could keep in a domestic fridge. Whereas with cryo, it has to be delivered from the transfusion centre without breaking the cold chain to the patient's home. And then stored in a minus 40 freezer. And even as home therapy, there would be a delay in being able to treat yourself because you've got to defrost it and draw it all up. It's much more difficult drawing up, 6 or 12 bags of gloopy stuff than it is having concentrate. So yes, there was limited use of cryo for home therapy, but it depended on a number of factors and it was never widespread.
Yes, well, I mean, we've heard a range of evidence in relation to that, so I'm not sure the evidence we've heard would support the characterisation of it as pilot in terms of its usage in the 70s.
Well, I honestly don't think there were large numbers of patients on home therapy with cryo, and most centres weren't doing it at all.
But in terms of your own direct experience, is this right, that you would have had no experience or little experience of patients in Sheffield on home therapy with cryoprecipitate, because by the time 1983 came along, it was all concentrates?
Well, it isn't just that. When I was a houseman, there were still patients switching from cryo to concentrate and going on to home therapy. So I did have some experience of routine treatment. I also came across it as a medical student when I did my paediatrics. But they never had a home therapy program with cryo in Sheffield.
And then you've said in your statement, and again in your oral evidence, that changing to cryoprecipitate or no treatment would dramatically increase the risk of hemorrhagic death, decrease life expectancy dramatically, and lead to more rapid deterioration of haemophilic arthropathy. Now, if we take out the reference to no treatment, Professor, what's the evidential basis for your assertion that changing to cryoprecipitate in 1983 would have dramatically increased the risk of death as a result of hemorrhage?
Well, hemorrhage at that time was the commonest cause of death in severe haemophilia. And the life expectancy estimate before the introduction of concentrates was about 40 years. Whereas I think Ritz et al., based on the early returns to Oxford, the National Haemophilia Database, calculated that life expectancy was about 67, 68.
So is the answer to my question that the factual or evidential basis for that assertion is Dr. Ritz's paper?
Yes.
if a return to cryoprecipitate had been not for haemophiliacs for the rest of their natural lives, but for a period of time, a year, 18 months, in the knowledge that work was being done on heat-treated products, that work was being done to identify what the virus was, that there might be a test for the virus. What basis is there for believing that a change to cryoprecipitate for a year or 18 months would dramatically increase the risk of death or decrease life expectancy dramatically?
Well, I mean, it would have, for that period of time, they would have been more at risk of dying from hemorrhage. Now, okay, yes, it's a limited period of time, and that would reduce the danger. But for most patients, it would have meant reverting to hospital-based treatment. Now, this was one of the great advantages of concentrate, because we knew that with haemophilic bleeding, the earlier you treated it, the less damage was done. And so when the patients had the treatment at home, they were told, if you think you've got a bleed, treat yourself immediately. It may not be a bleed, but you have a lot of personal experience, and they would be able to do so. Now, if they had to come into hospital and have cryo, it affected the way that they behaved, so that, if they lived a long way away, they'd think twice about coming into hospital. They would make sure they were certain it was a bleed before they considered treatment. So by the time they arrived in the hospital, they often had an advanced hemarthrosis, and then someone would assess them, decide they needed cryo, send to the blood bank. The blood bank would send the cryo, then they'd defrost it, then they'd draw it up, and then they'd administer it. So by the time you're finished, there's been a delay of a number of hours. Now, with a hemarthrosis, the result of that is that there is far more joint damage, and the hemarthrosis takes a lot longer to resolve. But I think you can probably argue that doesn't make a difference to life expectancy. If, on the other hand, they develop a headache, which may just be a headache, or it could be the early signs of an intracranial bleed, then a delay can be really life-threatening. So if somebody with haemophilia phones up the haemophilia centre and says, I've got this headache and it won't go away, you'd say to them, give yourself some factor VIII and come in to the hospital. Or maybe you'd organise transport, but they would have treatment before they left their house in that instance. And that could be a matter of life and death.
On this hypothetical scenario, the delay that you're describing could have been dramatically reduced by the provision of cryoprecipitate as a home therapy, to be used perhaps not on a regular basis, but in the event of an emergency such as that which you describe.
Yes, but I would suggest, home therapy with cryo happened in a few centres, a relatively small number of patients, setting it up on a national basis. The purchase of all those refrigerators, some patients wouldn't have had any room for it, would have been a major undertaking that couldn't have happened very quickly, I would imagine.
Sorry, Professor.
When do you suggest that they should have done that?
Well, Professor, I'm exploring with you what options were considered and what difference they might have, what the practical impediments might have been.
I think in most centres they considered that it was not a suitable product for home therapy for logistic reasons.
Do you accept or agree that the question of whether to take that risk of possibly delayed treatment in the event of a headache, or to take the risk of having less than ideal treatment for other bleeds and possible risks of joint damage, was a decision for the patient to take rather than for the physician to take for the patient?
That's an interesting philosophical question, because the big problem is that these decisions were being made on the basis of very little information. Even the guidelines that came out were not as evidence-based as we like our guidelines to be, because they were based on opinion, and the opinion was very poorly informed, because there were so many reasonable questions about AIDS and subsequently HIV that just were not known. A lot became clearer once a test became available.
Were patients, as a matter of fact, at the Sheffield Centre told...
I think it would have been an order of magnitude more difficult for the patients, because the conversation's going to be relatively uninformed.
Sorry, Professor, we had a slight problem with the internet connection then, but I think we got your answer.
Okay.
Were patients, as a matter of fact, from in the time that you were at Sheffield, so from April 1983 onwards, told of the possible risk of AIDS from the continuing use of factor concentrates?
I do recall having conversations with patients about AIDS. It was widely reported. Patients did ask about it. And to be honest, we weren't able to quantify the risks.
Were patients routinely given that information, such information as you had, or was it only discussed with them if they raised it with you?
They were routinely given that.
And what kind of information in 1983-84 do you think they were given?
I think they would have been told that there was some evidence that recipients of blood or blood products were developing AIDS, but that there were very few cases. And they were probably told that, as far as we could see, the risk was relatively small at that time. I think that was the general view.
Was any patient, as a matter of fact, given the choice to revert to cryoprecipitate?
I don't recall that.
Were there any attempts made in 83-84 to acquire more NHS concentrate in view of what was thought to be the increased risk of AIDS associated with commercial concentrates?
There may well have been, but I don't recall. There was always a supply problem with NHS concentrates. We could never get enough of them.
Was any consideration given, as far as you can recall, in this 83-84 period, to using porcine products for non-inhibitor patients in response to the risk of AIDS?
Very little. There are several things you need to know about porcine. In actual fact, the one clinician who used porcine factor VIII for non-inhibitor patients during this period was my predecessor in Manchester, who actually published a paper on this. And he had used it for surgery in a little treated patient to avoid the risk of non-A, non-B, and possibly whatever the AIDS virus was. But the product that was available at that time was, by modern standards, an intermediate purity product. It's essentially a concentrate of porcine factor VIII. if you use it in a non-inhibitor patient, a significant proportion of patients will develop antibodies, which are specific anti-porcine antibodies, and then you won't be able to use it again. And some will develop transfusion reactions with the product, and it tended to make your platelet count fall in a very predictable way, because it also included quite a lot of porcine von Willebrand factor, which causes human platelets to aggregate.
Was the predecessor at Manchester who used that? Are you referring to Dr. Wensley?
I am.
And do you recall the use of porcine product in the way that I've just discussed being actively considered at Sheffield by Professor Preston, or is it that it wasn't considered and you're suggesting reasons why it might not have been considered?
I can't remember it being discussed or considered. I only found out about Dr. Wensley much, much later.
You've referred in your statement, and indeed Professor Preston made reference to them, to there being a meeting or meetings involving a number of patients at the centre to discuss the risk of AIDS, or to discuss AIDS. Can you recall anything further about those meetings and how they were set up and what kind of matters were discussed?
Sorry, you broke up a little bit there. Are we talking about the journal club or the multidisciplinary meetings?
No, sorry, neither. My apologies, Professor Hay. Professor Preston told us about there having been a meeting with patients, and your statement, I think, also reflects that. A larger meeting, not a one-to-one patient meeting, a larger meeting or meetings to which patients were invited to discuss AIDS.
Yes.
What, if anything, can you recall about those?
I can't remember actually attending these. They were meetings between Eric and any patients who wanted to come along. I believe he discussed with them what was known about the issue at the time, and he had a number of them as the state of knowledge progressed, particularly once we had a test. Because the state of knowledge progressed very rapidly after that.
In terms of the Children's Hospital, and you were at the Children's Hospital for your first 6-month period, August 84 to April of 1985. Can you recall what, if any, discussion there was with the parents of patients at that hospital about the risks of AIDS?
I can't recall. I'm sure we will have discussed it with them. But I can't remember the nature of those discussions. I'm sure it would, amongst other things, have come up during the regular reviews.
Do you, or would you agree that the parents of children who were receiving factor concentrates that might expose them to a risk of AIDS were entitled to be told of that risk?
Yes, of course.
Now, you then returned to the Royal Hallamshire Hospital in, I think, April of 1985. By that time, what was the position in terms of the use of heat-treated products?
Well, I think Eric had switched over in, I think, December of the previous year, as many patients as he could, to alpha-profolate on the basis that there was some evidence of a model virus which they thought would be similar to what turned out to be the causative agent of AIDS, being heat labile. So it was quite a leap, to be perfectly honest, but I was giving the patients the benefit of the doubt. This was the safest product he had available to him. And there's no direct evidence that it was safe from the HIV point of view, but he thought that it might be. It clearly wasn't completely safe from the point of view of non-A, non-B hepatitis, but we didn't know at that time that the HIV virus was more heat labile than the hepatitis viruses. So it was actually easier to eradicate it using heat treatment methods that might be inadequate for hepatitis.
We know that in December of 1984, and you've exhibited to your statement the relevant document, UKHCDO produced a set of recommendations which included the recommendation to use heat-treated product. But your statement says, I think it's paragraph 48.4, that most haemophilia centres were obliged to continue to use some untreated concentrates until sometime in 1985. Was that because of insufficient supplies of the heat-treated products?
Yes. And some centres still had a preference for British products, which was impossible to satisfy because BPL had been so slow to even begin to address the issue of heat treatment. And what they did, as I recall, was to withdraw their unheated products and stick them in an oven and heat treat them and send them back. And the first heat-treated product that they produced in that way was essentially insoluble, and we couldn't use it. So there was, in effect, quite an interruption in supply of British products, and it took a while to sort out. And people were scratching around for any heat-treated product they could find. A lot of it was unlicensed, and there wasn't enough of it.
And do you know how long it took into 1985 for Sheffield to no longer be using untreated concentrates and to have exclusively heat-treated concentrates?
I can't remember exactly. I have actually looked at the annual returns for that year from the database in anticipation of this question. I couldn't get a clear view from that either, because it was quite clear that a variety of products were used during the course of that year. And that is despite the fact that Alpha was supplying preferentially those centres that had participated in their clinical trial.
And then in relation to those with haemophilia B, who has, I think, at Sheffield consistently been treated with NHS factor 9 concentrate.
Yes.
Do you have any recollection as to the point in time at which heat-treated factor 9 concentrate was available for the Sheffield patients?
Well, I think that they had to use alpha 9, if my memory serves me correctly, which was commercial, because it was later in 85, I think, that 9A heat-treated UK factor 9 became available. And in the interim, the only heat-treated factor 9 available would have been commercial.
Yes, if it helps, it was 2nd of October 1985 that all the factor 9 issued by BPL was heat-treated. That's my note.
Okay, fine, thank you.
Now, I wanted to ask you about the process of testing patients for HIV, HTLV3, at the Royal Hallamshire and then to the extent that you can recall at the Children's Hospital. The testing at the Royal Hallamshire from material that we've seen probably began in late 1984, and you'd have been at the Children's Hospital at that stage. But we understand from Professor Macris that the testing was on the basis of the stored samples. Do you have any knowledge yourself of the arrangements that were made for testing patients at the Royal Hallamshire for HTLV3 in late 84 or early 85?
Well, I wasn't there when it all started. I didn't remember it being from stored samples. I'm sure that stored samples were tested because that gives you historical background and a basis from which to tell the patient not only whether they've got HIV, but when they contracted the infection, which is useful to know. But my recollection is of patients coming up, having a chat, and then having a blood sample taken.
So is your recollection that patients were told in advance that they were going to be tested for HIV, HTLV3?
Yeah, I mean, it may well be that Professor Preston sent stored samples off to Professor Tedder in London at a point when the test was very experimental. The difficulty with that sort of thing, I mean, it was difficult enough once the test had been validated, because when you sit down with the patient and discuss the result, the implications of the test are not fully known. So it's quite a difficult conversation.
When you returned to the Royal Hallamshire in April of 1985, as far as you can recall, had all the patients been tested and informed of their diagnosis by then, or was that an ongoing process in which you were involved?
I was never very much involved in that. I think it was an ongoing process. I don't think they had stored samples on everybody, but it was undertaken as fast as they could, I think. Professor Preston spoke to the patients in his room, I think before and after testing.
Your statement suggests, in terms of the numbers who were found to be infected with HIV, that 24 had HIV, of which one was under the age of 18. We have slightly different figures from Professor Macris, not radically different, but slightly different. Can I ask, where has your information come from?
Well, my information, you can imagine I couldn't remember those numbers. So I went to the National Haemophilia database. He may have a different source.
And you're not in a position from the information you had to break it down by reference to whether it was haemophilia A or B from Willebrand's and severe and so on. Did you have any involvement in the testing of family members for HIV at the Royal Hallamshire?
I honestly don't remember. Family members would have been offered a test, particularly since it was recognised from a very early stage that the causative agent could be sexually transmitted.
The process of giving information to patients about their diagnosis and its significance, that was undertaken, was it by Professor Preston rather than by you?
Largely, though, obviously I would have come across these people in clinics, and naturally they would have wished to discuss it there too. And as far as partners are concerned, we were all encouraging patients to bring their partners with them to follow-up visits. and certainly to any discussions about testing.
And what, if any, knowledge do you have about seroconversions from heat-treated products for patients at the Royal Hallamshire?
I don't think there were any, though I am aware that there was an armour product used in other centres that was withdrawn because some patients contracted HIV from those products. And I think that was the subject of litigation, but I don't think that involved Sheffield.
Now, you were asked in your statement whether work was undertaken at Sheffield to establish the time period during which patients seroconverted. And you've said in your answer, some stored samples were available in Sheffield from some but not all patients, which enabled the approximate date of the initial infection to be determined. I recall that most had been infected in 1982 to 1984. Do you know when that exercise of trying to establish the dates of seroconversion was undertaken?
It would have been undertaken very early on at the time of initial testing, possibly before the test was fully validated.
And do you have any further information about that process and what it showed?
No.
And then in relation to the Children's Hospital, so you were at the Children's Hospital during that last part of 84 and first part of 85 when testing was becoming more widespread. What, if anything, can you recall about the process of testing the children at the Children's Hospital for HTLV3?
I don't think they had any stored samples. Professor Lilliman would have seen all of the parents individually and arranged testing.
So did you have any involvement in the process of informing parents that their children had tested positive?
It's the sort of thing that I think John Lilliman would have wanted to do himself.
Can I move on then to Liverpool, where you took up your post in 1987. Who was it that you succeeded as director at the centre?
Dr. B.A. McVerry.
Can you give us an outline of the facilities that the Liverpool Centre offered in 1987?
Well, the patients came along to the laboratory, which was in the Duncan building, which is an annex to the main Royal Liverpool Hospital building on the third floor. And there was a large clinical room in the middle of that laboratory, and that was the Haemophilia Centre. We had secretarial support, and I had a junior member of staff that rotated through thrombosis and hemostasis as part of the internal hospital rotation, but there were no other staff. There was no haemophilia nurse, no counsellor, no physiotherapy, and there were no joint clinics.
Was it a reference centre by 1987?
No, there weren't any reference centres. Well, there were, but Liverpool was never a reference centre. That was one of the designations from the early days. It did subsequently become a comprehensive care centre when those were that title was designated.
And your statement tells us, and again I think you've taken this from the National Haemophilia Database, that in 1987 there were 162 patients registered at the centre.
Yes.
What was your understanding of the approach to treatment at the centre that had prevailed in the early part of the 1980s? What products typically had been used? Do you know?
I think I've listed some of them, but basically a mixture of BPL and commercial products.
Had there been much use of cryoprecipitate at Liverpool?
I don't think so.
And do you know whether it had been a user of DDAVP for mild haemophiliacs and others?
I think latterly, yes.
What, if any, so by the time you got there in 1987, were all the concentrates that were being used heat treated?
Yes.
And do you know whether any of the Liverpool patients had seroconverted from heat treated products?
Not as far as I'm aware.
I think you raised a concern shortly after you arrived at Liverpool with Miss Spooner, I think, at Oxford, that you discovered that there were quite a few patients who were not registered with Oxford. Is that right?
That's correct.
Do you know how that had come about?
Well, I think they were just not very conscientious about reporting patients. I think it was a voluntary database, and I think patients commonly weren't reported. When I took over the database in 2002, there were only 16,000 registrants, and we now have well over 30,000. And I don't think that is reflecting the birth of new patients. I think it's reflecting previous historic underreporting, particularly of patients with mild bleeding disorders.
Do you have any recollection of what kind of proportion of patients had not been registered with Oxford prior to your arrival in 87?
Well, in the Liverpool Centre, I got the impression it was over 50%.
Over 50%?
Yes.
And when you then completed, I think you called them notification forms or something like that in your correspondence with Ms. Spooner, were those providing, or what kind of information was then provided about the patient to Oxford in those notification forms?
Well, the basic notification form just reported the patient's identifiers and their diagnosis and the severity of the diagnosis.
Did you report, either in relation to that cohort of patients or more generally, to Oxford, the HTLV3 or HIV positive status of your patients?
Yes, you'll come across all this when you read my still not completely written report that goes at the end of the statistical report. But there were separate forms for reporting the details of HIV. And as you've already observed, Dr. Kraske initiated that process, and it continued for a number of years. So yes, I filled those forms out as well.
And did you tell your patients that you were providing that information about them to Oxford?
I think that I did.
What did you learn at Liverpool about how patients had been told that they were HTLV3 positive?
Well, the patients told me very little information from Dr. McVerry himself. They told me that they had been informed by post.
So they learnt they were HTLV3 positive by a letter from the centre?
That's right.
And in terms of the numbers of patients at Liverpool who were found to be HTLV3 positive, I've just lost the reference to the numbers. I think you've said in your statement, in Liverpool, 43 patients had HIV, of whom 4 were children.
Yes.
And you've taken that from the National Haemophilia database rather than any Liverpool records?
I have.
Okay. So I note the time. Is that a convenient point at which to stop?
Yes, it is. We take a break for lunch. 2 o'clock, if you please, Professor. 2 o'clock, everyone. I'll see you then.
Fine. Thank you. Thank you.